To continue the discussion, we'll have two representatives of the world of aquaculture, Dr. Michael Rubino from NOAA Fisheries Service, and I think we'll be able to extend a lot of what Carol Ann has just said about how the ocean and its impacts on climate is affecting agriculture and agricultural productivity and investment in understanding how the oceans relate to climate processes into the world of aquaculture as well, because it has dramatic impacts also on the aquaculture industry. Michael?
Well, Rick, thanks for that transition. Good afternoon. Thank you to the consortium for inviting me and for inviting NOAA to be part of your policy forum. Last November, I was in New Orleans with a couple of people in this room at a meeting convened by sort of a who's who in Gulf seafood. So these are the processors, the buyers, the market makers in seafood. And they invited commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, state fisheries directors, aquaculture entrepreneurs to spend a day and a half to talk about aquaculture. So this is in the Gulf. Why would they want to do that? Those buyers, those market makers are being criticized by their clients, by the restaurants, by the supermarkets, for not providing local fish. There's a lot of shrimp in the Gulf, but not a lot of fish coming out of the Gulf. If you go to New Orleans to a wholesaler, there are thousands and thousands of pounds a week of frozen fillets from Asia coming in, going into the restaurants in New Orleans. Not a lot of local fish. So these market makers are asking commercial fishermen to work with aquaculture entrepreneurs. They don't care if it comes from a pond or a tank or a net pen, to bring local fish back to the table. So in a couple of minutes, I was going to give you sort of a quick update on where we are with marine aquaculture in the United States, and then a little bit about what you, as the research community, can do and continue to do with us, government, and more particularly with industry, to sort of accelerate production of marine aquaculture in the United States. So why are we doing this? It's about the seafood. It's about food security. You've heard about that. It's about the trade deficit. It's also about people. People in coastal communities. People from coastal communities really all to the agricultural heartland, that whole value chain. These are people who produce our food. You know, we've done a great job in this country of ending overfishing, putting all of our wild stocks under management programs, but that's limited the opportunity for folks in coastal communities to be in the maritime industry. Aquaculture is a developing area for people to stay on the water, to keep working waterfronts going. We heard earlier today that it's also about health. The latest nutritional guidelines indicate that for men and for women at all ages, we're eating less than half of the seafood that we should be eating. Particularly those oily marine fish and salmon that are superfoods, high in omega-3s and other nutrients. It's also about healthy oceans. I think there's an emerging consensus that aquaculture is one of the most resource-efficient ways to produce food. You can grow a lot of fish or seafood in a very small space with very little feed relative to terrestrial agriculture. And there are even forms of aquaculture like shellfish farming and seaweed farming that take nutrients from the environment and don't even have to be fed. Yes, of course, like any human activity, aquaculture can be done well or poorly, so there can be environmental effects of aquaculture. You've heard about pollution, waste, disease, escapes, and so on. We now have 30 years of experience in places like the United States about what to do and what not to do. So like in other fields, those environmental issues, which are still real in many parts of the world, can be addressed. You can have responsible, sustainable aquaculture of all different kinds of forms. And I've had the privilege in this job of being able to go around the country and see that in practice. And like farmers on land, seafood farmers are very proud of what they do. It's also a huge global business opportunity. The picture of the Boston Seafood Show, which will reconvene in Boston in a couple of weeks. The convention center must be 4 soccer fields, and I say soccer, not football, because it is a global football game. You quickly realize to what extent we, the United States, are a huge consumer of seafood. We're a modest player in wild capture seafood. We're a tiny player in aquaculture. And you go to the Boston Seafood Show and that becomes really quite evident, and why we're importing so much of the seafood that we eat. So we have the people, we have the technology, we have a huge marine ocean space. Why aren't we doing more in aquaculture, and particularly in marine aquaculture? There are a lot of people who live in this country. Our coastlines are crowded. A lot of us live in coastal areas. So there's a lot of conflicting uses. Wind farming is running into the same thing. Everyone is in favor of wind farms, but if it's in your viewscape, you'd prefer it not to be there. If you go up to Maine, there's lobster pots everywhere. People are used to that. In the Chesapeake Bay, crab pots everywhere. We're used to that. But if you want to put a buoy, a line, and a cage with oysters in it, that's new and different. We could grow all the fish that we import from Chile, all of that salmon, in 1/3 of 1% of the Puget Sound. One of those factoids people come up with. It's about 10 marinas. You can get 10 marinas permitted, but get 10 fish farms permitted in the Puget Sound area. It's really about social license. It's about wanting to make room in our backyards to grow seafood and to become comfortable with that. You heard from Bill Dewey this morning about how difficult it is to get a permit. This is the permit process in Bill's state of Washington. I think, and my colleagues at other federal and state agencies think, that we can collapse that permit process to make it more efficient, not lose any of our safeguard missions, but we really need your help from a political and a social perspective to make that happen. So there is good news too, though. I heard Hank's Oyster Bar mentioned. If you go to coastal communities from Maine down through the Carolinas these days, aquaculture is booming. Oysters, clams, mussels, seaweed, even fish farming. This is changing coastal communities all up and down the East Coast. There's a generational change happening as well. Again, because of the lack of jobs in fishing, or because of the limits on being able to exchange lobster licenses, a lot of the next generation of folks, sons and daughters from fishing and seafood families, are engaged in aquaculture. On the West Coast, our large seafood companies, the ones who catch pollock in Alaska and process a lot of seafood on the West Coast, think Pacific Seafood, Trident, Icicle, now owned by Cook, are now amongst the largest US aquaculture producers. Salmon, steelhead, oysters, abalone. All of their processing and distribution, their markets here in the United States. They and their colleagues are worried literally that China is eating our lunch. All of that seafood they're importing from Asia and process and serve to us, because of the growth of the middle class in Asia, may no longer be available to us, or will only be available at a higher price. Chinese are willing to go up to Maine and buy lobsters at prices that we are not willing to pay. So that, I think, is, these kinds of things are changing the social dynamic. You'll hear from Sebastian Bell in a minute about Maine. If I had to pick one place in the country to go see marine aquaculture in action, I would go to Maine. All of the innovation, all of the, from the governor to the state legislature to the university system to expedited permitting to working waterfront coalitions, all of that you can see happening in Maine. We need more Maines around the country if we're going to do this. But in places like Maine, you're seeing more bumper stickers that look like this. And I couldn't resist taking this picture at last year's NOAA Fish Fry. This is a group from Cape Cod, Wellfleet, where you've got commercial fishermen, commercial aquaculture, and restoration aquaculture NGOs all co-sponsoring a table together. You know, it's really not about hunting and farming anymore in seafood. It's about using a range of technologies to produce seafood. And that's what you're seeing more and more of on the working waterfront. There's less of this division between fishing and farming, or fishing and aquaculture. So we haven't been sitting still on research and development either. I mean, the US is an incredible engine of R&D. A lot of that technology is being transferred to the private sector. A lot of it is going with US investment dollars overseas, and we're re-importing the product. But that's been a bright spot for us as well. You heard this morning from Megan Davis about recirculating aquaculture systems. Well, another one of the new frontiers is going further offshore. Our R&D programs, and a number of you in this room have been involved in developing those technologies as well. The first offshore fish farm, offshore mussel farm in federal waters in California is having its first harvest in a couple of weeks. In the Gulf of Mexico, after many years of planning, 6 federal agencies have signed an MOU to set up a consolidated permit process for fish farming in the Gulf of Mexico in federal waters. That may be a model for other parts of the country going forward as well. So it's not happening yet, but this is opening up new frontiers and new places to do seafood farming. So where do we go from here? What is to be done? That proverbial question. If you look at the strategies on aquaculture for the past 30 years, and there's a large stack of them, they pretty much all say the same thing. And these 3 elements, so doing a little bit better on regulatory efficiency without losing our safeguards, keeping short-term research and development going that gets quickly translated to production, and then for agencies like NOAA working with USDA and others on that long-term research we need to do on genetics, genomics, feeds, aquatic animal health management. That's where you come in. So we need your help on the management side, on the regulatory side, what one of my colleagues calls tools for rules, or science for management. You know, you can map out the Gulf of Mexico, do GIS, look at all the currents, sensitive ecological areas, shipping lanes, oil and gas. Where are we going to put fish farms and oyster farms, let alone algae farms? What about whale and turtle migration routes? We need your help on siting models, water quality and benthic impact models, genetic escapes models, aquatic animal health management. We have some of those models, but they need to be refined with your help. We have ways of working with you both through competitive grants and through collaborative agreements with our science centers. The National Sea Grant College Program currently has a request for proposals on aquaculture out on the street right now. We are particularly interested in projects that will yield a production or help to break bottlenecks in production in the next 2 years to 4 years, as well as smaller grants to deal with some of the software issues in how do we get to aquaculture production. Obviously, we've done a lot of partnerships and collaboration over time, and many of you have been involved in those, and we'd like to continue to do those, whether they be on commercial aquaculture, restoration aquaculture, enhancement of fisheries. These are some of the examples that are ongoing, and one of note is it's always nice to spend other people's money. We were able to leverage NOAA working with the algae community, got the Department of Energy interested in marine algae. We think, why Department of Energy and marine algae? Well, eventually biofuels, but you need to learn how to grow the algae first. So I think that RFP closed just recently. I can imagine 7, 10 projects of several $1 million each to help us learn about algae production over the next several years. And it's not just learning about production, it's learning about siting. It's learning, put anything in the ocean, you've got conflicting uses that have to be adjudicated and thought about. So that DOE money will help us to do that as well. One parting thought, and this is a picture of Gary Wickfers, who was our lead scientist at the Milford Lab in Milford, Connecticut. This was sort of the place where shellfish farming was invented in the United States, and is still sort of the heart and soul of shellfish research on the East Coast for many. Gary's standing in front of one of the country's reference collections of marine microalgae. Gary and his colleagues give these away as starter algae to hatcheries around the country. They've trained several generations of hatchery technicians on marine algae for shellfish farming. They're developing probiotics that can be used in shellfish hatcheries and in shellfish production. And that technology is going out into the private sector with partners. These are the kind of collaborations that we would like to do more of that then make a difference in terms of working waterfronts and the ability to produce shellfish and ultimately wind up at Hank's Oyster Bar. So thanks very much.